IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. It's the day after the annual budget, and I'm sure that's what's on everybody's mind right now. And I promise you we'll have our take on the budget right here on this podcast very soon. And I can also promise you that it'll be a considered take based on a careful perusal of the document. But for now, I want to talk about a long ignored aspect of Asia's international politics. Because when we talk about the major bilateral relations in Asia on this podcast, we usually think about, say, China's ties with various countries or the Quad or ASEAN. But today, I'd like to talk about a bilateral relationship that doesn't usually get a lot of coverage here in India. That's the ties between Russia and Japan. Now, I hardly have to tell you that Russia-Japan ties have been one of the big stories of the last century. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05 led to a failed revolution in Russia that, of course, presaged a much greater upheaval 12 years later in 1917 that eventually led to the creation of the Soviet Union. Another 20 years after that, in 1939, it was the turn of the Japanese to be defeated in the clashes at Khalkhin-Gol or Nomonhan in what is today Mongolia and Inner Mongolia. And in the years after those battles, Japan turned its attention seawards towards what we now call the Indo-Pacific, while the Soviets could turn their resources westwards on defeating Nazi Germany. Now, once Germany was defeated in 1945, the Soviets could swing back eastwards, declaring war on Japan on the night of 9th August 1945, just hours before Nagasaki went up in flames. That declaration of war by the Soviets was certainly a major factor in Japan's decision to surrender. Now, the events of 1945 are especially pertinent to us today because in the last days of that war, the Soviets took over 4 Kuril Islands from Japan. The two countries continue to dispute ownership over those islands, and it's perhaps the biggest stumbling block on the path towards better relations. Now, to discuss this subject, I'm joined today by Aditya Pareek. So this is going to be one of those episodes with two Adityas. There's me, Aditya Ramanathan, and Aditya Pareek. And Aditya Pareek has been following Russia-Japan relations for quite a while. He's very passionate about the subject and very well informed. So firstly, Aditya, welcome back to All Things Policy.
Thank you, Aditya. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, likewise. So I want to start by just having you give us a basic overview of Russia-Japan relations today. What are some of the big issues and how much do they roughly trade with each other today?
So I think the main fulcrums that define the contemporary Russia-Japanese relationship, it's the motivations of the two countries. In their trade ties and in their territorial disputes lie the main answer to your question. So Japan is mainly motivated by commercial fishing in the waters around the Kurils. And Russia is motivated by the economic prospects post-sanctions resulting from the annexation of Crimea in 2014. So now every ruble counts, and Japan extending this hand of economic cooperation is something that they really would like to follow up on. So talking about the bilateral trade, because of the coronavirus pandemics and the worldwide lockdowns, the figure for the year by trade volume would be expected to fall below about 20 billion US dollars. This is coming after an uptick of 3 years, actually. So it's a huge setback for bilateral trade volume-wise. And I remember back in January 2019, President Putin was very keen on stressing that the trade volume could be exceeding $30 billion annually. So this has been a huge letdown for the Russian side. And Japan, since it's under a new administration, is also following through now with new measures, which we'll be talking about later in the episode, I believe.
Yeah, so Aditya, I'm so glad that you brought up this issue of sanctions and of the new administration in Japan, because Japan's previous Prime Minister Shinzo Abe apparently visited Russia 11 times and made a serious effort towards strengthening the ties between the two countries. The sanctions he imposed after the annexation of Crimea in 2014 were fairly nominal, were actually, in a sense, seem to have been designed to not really have any effect on the Russians. So he did this, of course, at the cost of, irritating the Americans. But Shinzo Abe was so clearly committed to strengthening those ties. Does the new administration in Japan share those priorities? Or have Russia-Japan ties been sort of downgraded in importance under Prime Minister Suga?
Well, I think Russia being the immediate neighbor of Japan is something that the Japanese can't really overlook. I mean, the US is an ocean away, even though they have a very strong relationship. They have a huge security cooperation going on since the Second World War. But still, Japan really has to keep its house in order and its neighborhood in order. So the relationship with the Russians is quite important to be downgraded. I would say it can't really be downgraded ever. That's not going to happen. The US is a factor in that relationship, but not primarily, I would say, because we wouldn't see the kind of cooperation that we saw under Prime Minister Abe's prime ministership and now the new Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga's. So I would say the previous Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's main contribution to the relationship was an 8-point economic cooperation plan in 2016, which he presented to President Putin. The main purpose behind this initiative was to soften the Russian public opinion on returning Kurils. So some analysts believe that this calculation is supposed to be emerging from the leverage, the political leverage that the Japanese side can gain by offering this economic cooperation. And in return, they would receive the softening of Russian public opinion on returning the Kurils, the 4 islands in the chain that Japan is concerned with.
Yeah, we've seen some movement, certainly from the Russians, about, a possible deal on the Kuril Islands. But what are some of the recent developments over there? Is a deal still on the cards, or has the situation really changed?
The deal is definitely still on the cards. At least that has been the impression that both sides have given. I mean, they put out statements that we don't want to leave this issue for future generations and we'd rather solve it now. In reply to your question that Prime Minister Suga, what has his approach been since he took over? So I don't think there has been a major departure from what Prime Minister Abe was doing, that economic cooperation would lead the way for the eventual return of the islands. But the question really with Yoshihide Suga is how many islands are we talking about? So as we know, in 1956, there was a joint Soviet-Japanese declaration which talked about the return of 2 islands at least. And then in 1993, after the fall of the Soviet Union and when the state capacity of Russia was quite constrained by the economic impact of things, President Yeltsin was in power and he was quite ready to settle the dispute, and all 4 islands were on the cards with the 1993 Tokyo Declaration. So Prime Minister Abe was basing most of his effort on the 1956 declaration. But the only departure from Prime Minister Abe's policy now under Suga has been that the focus is no longer on the return of 2 islands, but all 4. And the main tool of persuasion is still the same as Prime Minister Abe's, that is economic cooperation. But there's another thing about the North Sea route, which has recently come to light in the past few days, that they are now considering that the logistics, and these are the words of the Japanese ambassador to the Russian Federation, that the logistics of the North Sea route are 40% more efficient compared to traditional shipping routes. So he's talking about how currently cargo from Japan to Moscow and then to Europe is delivered mainly along the Southern Sea route through the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. So that takes anywhere from 57 to 62 days. So now the Northern Sea route is going to cut that short significantly. And using the Trans-Siberian Railway in conjunction, this has the potential to reduce the total time of shipping in this region to about 20 to 27 days.
That is absolutely fascinating. And it's, the two countries are using both their economic clout and in the case of Russia, changing geography in a sense, to offer carrots to each other as part of a effort to come to a broader deal. Now, those are the carrots. What about the sticks? What is the rhetoric coming out of Japan? And more importantly, I think, what is the rhetoric coming out of Moscow on the Kuril Islands?
The Moscow has this problem that the regime currently in power has based its bottom line on legitimacy with the territorial integrity of Russia. So Putin, Yeltsin both wanted to make concessions in the Kuril Islands dispute, but the public opinion that Putin has, engineered in the past few decades that he is supposed to be the person who would return Russia back to its glory days, back to its place in the world as a major power. So that kind of comes back to bite them. And you can see this reflected in something that has happened in the past year. So in July 2020, we know that a new Russian constitution was adopted. So this new constitution has provisions that talk about banning any talk of alienation of Russian territories. So there is a complete ban on anyone advocating that. So this was consolidated by Putin signing an amendment on 8th December 2020. That has provisions for 6 to 10 years of imprisonment for individuals in Russia that are advocating territorial concessions, regardless of which part of Russian territory. So this applies equally to Crimea. This applies equally to the Kuril Islands. So we can't really say that the Kuril Islands can be treated separately from the situation in Crimea, because the narrative can't be applied selectively. And, if you go by opinion polls, most citizens of Russia, they oppose the handover of Kuril Islands to Japan. 96% of the locals on the island feel the same.
Yeah, it's hardly surprising that the locals themselves will be quite anxious about any transfer of sovereignty. Anytime there's territory with people on it, any form of transfer of sovereignty becomes extremely problematic. Not to mention, like you pointed out, the complications involving Crimea. Now, what I want to get into is the naval and military aspect of this. The Russians have for a long time been focused on Europe, obviously, but they do also see themselves as a sort of Asia-Pacific power, and they do have some degree of military presence in the Western Pacific. What is it like, and how significant is that to the Kuril Islands?
The thing is, both sides have been vocal about the Kuril Islands dispute, but nobody seriously believes that Japan would at any point try to invade and take over the islands. So that's not something that's in the realm of practicality. But Russia still has this thing that whenever they talk about hard power, they always match it with some sort of a hardware and boots on the ground presence. At least it has been my observation in the past few years. So I think Russia, being the side that is more averse to actually solving the issue recently, another indicator of that has been that Russia has deployed an S-300 V4 multi-layered air defense system to the islands. So this system can to some degree mitigate the qualitative disadvantage that the Russian aerospace forces suffer against their Japanese counterparts. So there has been a instance where a very interesting thing related to this came up. So the deputy head of the Russian Parliament Defense Committee, he went on record saying that Russia has the political will and determination to ensure that they will not lose a war against Japan, despite these qualitative disadvantages in some area. He, although refused to elaborate on what exactly was lacking, he didn't wish to say so in public. But the thing is, this was in response to media reports, assessments, op-eds talking about how Japan has superior fighter jets and they could potentially overwhelm the defense of the islands were a war to be declared between the two countries. So this was in response to those reports, those op-eds appearing in Russian and Japanese press. So Russia has also, at least according to some print media reports, contemplated that T-72B3 tanks might be deployed to the islands. So all in all, existing hardware and prospective hardware included, this looks like a pretty good hardware and boots on the ground being matched with the rhetoric that's coming out of the politicians.
All right. And how do the Japanese see this military presence? Does it alarm them in any way?
Well, as far as I understand, they are not looking to invade. So it doesn't really alarm them in the sense. But yeah, they have registered diplomatic protests that you have deployed this air defense system. And considering the range of the system, yeah, I mean, it could be a problem, even if we are not talking about the easy of the Kuril Islands. So they have at least protested diplomatically.
Okay. So, Aditya, so far, Russia-Japan relations, despite the problems, have been fairly stable. And in the last few years, we've seen some degree, at least, of optimism, despite these occasional setbacks. Are there, however, some negative factors that could create a worsening of relations, that could loosen or problematize ties between the two countries?
Until the last month, that is January 2021, the narrative that I was seeing across both countries' press was that the Japanese-Russian economic cooperation, which has direct implications on the Kuril Islands in terms of their larger economies, imports, exports, and the infrastructure development projects on the islands themselves. So that was going to the cold box. So impression was that the Russian side was generally frustrated that, hey, a lot of investment was promised, but it's not coming through. So there were plenty of reasons for that. Chief among them that Japanese private enterprise was kind of spooked that Western sanctions would break their back elsewhere if they were to invest in Russian land on Russian projects. So there were a lot of mixed signals and anecdotal points of friction. So I can quote a few if you want. So there might be a potential ban on timber exports to Japan from Russia in the year 2021. Honda apparently is withdrawing from the Russian market altogether. This is important because apparently majority of imported cars sold in Russia are of Japanese origin. There's also the issue of, as I previously mentioned, Japanese fishing vessels, which have quotas to fish in the waters around the Kurils. A huge industry in Japan depends on it. A lot of mouths are being fed by that industry. And as outsiders, we might not appreciate the magnitude of the economic impact if those ships don't come back with their catch to the Japanese economy. But it's significant. I mean, if you were to be a person in Japan, you'd realize just how much those auctions for the catches mean to the Japanese economy and people and the culture. So there's been this issue that Russian border guards who zealously guard the easy and the territorial waters around the Kurils against all intruders. So this includes Japanese fishermen. And there's been this tendency that they subject the Japanese vessels, which are formally there after a formalized process of catches being set for them, that this much amount would be paid to Russia in exchange for XYZ vessels. This is the list. They would catch so many of this species, so many of this species. So even after those agreements, the Russian border guards in those waters have this tendency to stop and rigorously search these Japanese fishing vessels. And this delays their fishing activities. It reduces their catch, and it overall has a very bad impact on this whole business. So Japan really has no other option but to cooperate with whatever the Russian authorities throw at them.
Right. Yeah. These seem to be quite a series of problems. I want to end, Aditya, by just asking you, what are some rays of hope? Are there some upticks that we see in these bilateral ties?
Considering we've already talked about the Northern Sea route development and the new approach of logistics, I think there are still a few anecdotes that I can, quote from news stories in both countries about other projects that offer a ray of hope in their economic cooperation. So these would be mainly concerned with hydrocarbon imports and clean energy and regional shipping. So Japan is set to increase the use of hydrogen to meet its obligation in terms of reducing carbon emissions. So Japan takes its going green very seriously. So Russia can, in the short term, emerge as the biggest supplier of hydrogen to Japan. Russia also sees opportunities to export methanol to Japan. There's a plant upcoming in Russia's Amur region. So that plant might be able to supply methanol to Japan. Japan has also received an offer to increase the volume of container shipments through the Trans-Siberian Railway, as we previously talked about. So the Russian side has shown warmth to the idea that they would further subsidize it, the shipment by Japanese companies and Japanese enterprise if the volume of the actual shipments can be increased. So for now, the plans were for this specific transport and logistic company from Japan called Hankyu Hanshin Express. So they were supposed to ship some auto parts and industrial equipment amounting to like 20 cubic meters of cargo every shipment. So this has been delayed twice now. So once it was delayed in December and then in January. Now it's supposed to be happening in February, which is this month. These shipments to Europe, as I previously pointed out, are going to reduce the time through the use of Trans-Siberian Railway. For a shipment that used to take 57 to 62 days, now it might take 20 to 27 days. So that's a huge ray of hope that both sides are warm to these new means of trans-shipping. And I think that would define the cooperation between these two countries going forward.
That is so fascinating. Russia in the Far East and Japan occupy such a fascinating and definitely consequential geography for all of Asia. And it's going to be really interesting to see how trade and strategy is played along in these regions. We'll definitely be watching this space. We will come back to this subject again in the near future. Thank you so much for enlightening us about Russia-Japan ties today, Aditya.
It was a pleasure, Aditya, and I'd love to do this again.
Absolutely. And thank you all for joining us on All Things Policy. Like I promised, we'll have our take on the budget very soon. Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Storytel and The Whole Truth Foods. Thank you for supporting us. So, great week on the network again this week. Definitely do check out the Pragati podcast. Pavan spoke to Krish Ashok. They discussed science, knowledge, and the wonder of Indian home cooking. Staying in the realm of food, on This Round Is On Me, we had A.D. Singh as a guest. Gauri and A.D. discussed the 10 years anniversary of The Table and the 20-year anniversary of Olive. So two of Bombay's biggest restaurateurs have a conversation about the restaurant business. All Things Policy celebrated 500 episodes on January 27th. Manoj talks to Aditya and Anirudh about the surprising origins of the podcast, its evolution over the last few years, and its exciting future. This episode also marks their video debut, so definitely do check that out on YouTube. On Storytellers and Storysellers, Vineet talks to Ranjit Pratap Singh. Ranjit is the co-founder and CEO of Pratilipi. Pratilipi is a company that's recently acquired IVM, and Ranjit on this episode discusses his plans to build a homegrown media empire, his love for comics, and how India can have its own comic cinematic universe. And finally, Cyrus had an exciting week. We had some amazing guests this week. We had Vishal Gondal come and talk about Fauji. We had Atish Tathir talk about the various issues that he had been facing with his OCI card and other things like that. We had Adam Dow talk about things going on in the US and the evolution of what's happening there. We had Siddharth Kannan come and talk about his history with Cyrus and his new show. So definitely do come check that out as well. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Do you wonder what goes inside the mind of an achiever? How do they manage to get back up on their feet in spite of their failures? Do they really do something different? You're absolutely right. Yes, they do. I'm Aditya Surana. Join me every Wednesday and Friday on my show Absolutely Right, where I use my special tool of handwriting analysis, also known as graphology, to interview high performers and study secrets behind their success and personality. You can catch us on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you get your podcast from.